On Christmas Eve, my parents gave my sister a diamond necklace while they tossed me a pair of socks. Laughter filled the room. My chest burned, but I stayed silent. Hours later, when the party ended, I handed them an envelope. They thought it was my gift, until they read the eviction notice. The room froze. The diamond necklace had caught the light from our Christmas tree like captured stars, each facet throwing rainbows across Madison's perfect face as she squealed with delight. Mom and Dad beamed at her reaction, their eyes soft with the kind of love I'd watched them shower on my younger sister for 26 years. "It's gorgeous," Madison had gushed, holding the necklace up for everyone to admire. "Mom, Dad, you shouldn't have spent so much. Nothing's too good for our princess," Dad said, the same phrase he'd been using since Madison could walk. He helped fasten the necklace around her neck, while Mom took photos, both of them glowing with parental pride. Then it was my turn, 28 years old, and still hoping, pathetically, that this year might be different, that this Christmas might be the one where they remembered I existed as more than an afterthought. Dad reached under the tree and grabbed a hastily wrapped package, clearly forgotten until the last moment. "Here you go, Rachel," he said without even looking at me, already turning back to admire how the necklace looked on Madison. I unwrapped the gift with trembling fingers, knowing before I opened it that my heart was about to break again. Inside was a 3-pack of athletic socks from Target, still with the price tag, $4.99. "Thanks," I managed to whisper, my throat closing around the words. "Socks," Madison laughed, not unkindly but not kindly either. "Well, at least they're practical." Mom nodded absently. "We thought you could use them for the gym." The gym I couldn't afford, because I'd been sending most of my paycheck to help with their mortgage for the past 3 years. The gym they didn't know I couldn't afford, because I'd never told them about the financial help I'd been providing. But they'd never asked about my life anyway, too busy celebrating Madison's latest achievement or relationship or career milestone. I sat through the rest of Christmas Eve dinner with the socks in my lap, watching my family fawn over Madison's new jewelry while she regaled them with stories from her job at the marketing firm, stories about client dinners and office parties, and the promotion she was hoping for, none of which mentioned that her current position existed only because I'd called in a favor with a colleague who owed me. They didn't know about that either. They didn't know about a lot of things. As the evening wound down and the extended family filtered out, aunts and uncles and cousins who'd also brought Madison thoughtful gifts while offering me polite smiles and generic well wishes, I retrieved the envelope from my purse. My hands were steady now, the trembling replaced by a cold resolve that had been building for years. "I have something for you too," I said, standing in the doorway of the living room where Mom, Dad, and Madison were cleaning up wrapping paper. Dad looked up with surprise, as if he'd forgotten I was still there. "Oh, Rachel, sweetheart, you didn't have to get us anything." "I insist," I said, holding out the envelope. "Merry Christmas." Mom took it with a curious smile, probably expecting a gift card, or maybe a heartfelt letter expressing my gratitude for their love and support. Madison looked over her shoulder as Mom opened the envelope, the diamond necklace catching the light with her movement. I watched their faces change as they read the legal document inside. Mom's smile faltered first, confusion creeping into her eyes. Dad's brow furrowed as he leaned in to read over her shoulder. Madison's expression shifted from casual interest to alarm as she saw their reactions. "What is it?" Madison asked, but Mom and Dad were both staring at the paper in stunned silence. "It's an eviction notice," Mom finally whispered, her voice barely audible. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Dad snatched the paper from Mom's hands, reading it again as if he could change the words through sheer force of will. "Eviction notice?" Madison shrieked. "What do you mean eviction notice? Who's evicting you?" Dad's eyes found mine across the room, and for the first time in years, he was really looking at me, really seeing me. "Rachel," he said slowly, "what is this?" "It's exactly what it says," I replied, my voice calm despite the hurricane of emotions swirling in my chest. "You have 30 days to vacate the premises." "But who sent this?" Mom demanded, her voice rising with panic. "Who's evicting us? We've never missed a mortgage payment." I smiled then, the first genuine smile I'd managed all evening. "You haven't missed a payment because I've been making them for you, for 3 years. And now I'm stopping." The silence that followed was deafening. I could hear the grandfather clock in the hallway ticking, the heat clicking on in the basement, Madison's sharp intake of breath. "What are you talking about?" Dad's voice was barely a whisper. "I'm talking about the fact that this house, the house you raised us in, the house you love so much, the house where you just gave Madison a diamond necklace worth more than my annual salary, belongs to me now. I bought it from the bank when you were 3 months behind on payments and about to lose it. I've been paying the mortgage, the taxes, the insurance, everything, and you never even noticed." Madison's hand flew to her throat, fingers touching the diamond necklace like it might burn her. "Rachel, you can't be serious." I've never been more serious in my life. I pulled another envelope from my purse, this one thicker. The deed is in my name, has been for 3 years. You're living in my house, and I want you out. The room was so quiet I could hear my own heartbeat. 3 faces stared at me with identical expressions of shock and disbelief, as if I'd just announced I was an alien from another planet. Finally, Dad found his voice. Rachel, honey, if this is true, and I'm not saying I believe it, but if it's true, why didn't you tell us? Why didn't you say something? I looked at him, this man who'd raised me but never really seen me, and felt 28 years of hurt and disappointment crystallize into something sharp and cutting, because I wanted to see how long it would take you to notice, how long it would take you to wonder how you were suddenly able to afford the payments again, how long it would take you to ask where the money was coming from. I shrugged. Turns out the answer is never. You never wondered. You never asked. You just accepted it and kept treating me like I was nothing. Mom was crying now, mascara running down her cheeks. Rachel, we don't treat you like nothing. We love you. Do you? I asked quietly. Because tonight, you gave Madison a diamond necklace and gave me socks, and that pretty much sums up the last 28 years of my life. The frozen silence stretched between us like a chasm that had been years in the making. Mom clutched the eviction notice with trembling hands, while Dad stared at me as if I'd transformed into someone he'd never seen before. Madison had gone completely pale, the diamond necklace now seeming to weigh heavily around her neck. Rachel, Dad finally managed, his voice hoarse. This can't be real. You're upset about the gifts. I understand that, but this is our home. You can't just... I can, and I am. I reached into my purse again and pulled out a manila folder. These are copies of all the documents. The original mortgage that you defaulted on, the bank's foreclosure proceedings, the deed transfer when I purchased the property. It's all legal and binding. Madison sank into the armchair, the one she'd always claimed as hers during family gatherings. I don't understand. How do you even have that kind of money? You work at a nonprofit. I work at a nonprofit now, I corrected, but I haven't always. Before I took the job at the Children's Advocacy Center, I was a patent attorney specializing in pharmaceutical law. I made very good money for 5 years before I decided to do something that actually mattered. The revelation hit them like another bomb. Mom's mouth fell open, and Dad actually stumbled backward a step. A patent attorney? Mom whispered. But you never said, we thought you were struggling, living paycheck to paycheck like most people your age. You thought that because you never asked. You never showed any interest in my career or my life or my choices. The words came out sharper than I'd intended, but I was past caring about their feelings. I've been living in a studio apartment and driving a 10-year-old car while sending you $1,500 a month to keep you from losing your house. Money I earned working 70-hour weeks at a job I hated so I could afford to take care of you. But why? Madison's voice was small, confused. Why would you do that without telling us? I looked at my sister, this beautiful, privileged woman who'd never had to worry about anything because everyone around her made sure she didn't have to. Because I kept thinking that eventually you'd notice. That eventually someone in this family would realize I was making sacrifices, that someone would ask how I was managing, that someone would care enough to pay attention. Dad was reading through the documents now, his face growing more ashen with each page. Rachel, these dates. You bought the house 3 days before we would have lost it. You saved us from foreclosure. Yes, I did. And not one of you ever wondered how the mortgage suddenly got caught up. Not one of you questioned why the threatening letters from the bank stopped coming. You just accepted it and moved on with your lives. We didn't know the letters were coming, Mom protested. We didn't know we were behind on the payments, because Dad had been hiding the financial problems from you and Madison for months. But I knew. He called me in desperation the night before the foreclosure sale, begging me to loan him money. I turned to Dad, watching his face crumple with shame. You remember that conversation, don't you? You were crying, telling me how you couldn't bear to lose the family home, how it would devastate Mom and Madison to have to start over. Dad closed his eyes, and I could see him remembering that terrible phone call. You said you'd handle it. You said not to worry about it anymore, and you didn't. You never asked how I handled it, never questioned where the money came from, never followed up to see if I was okay after emptying my savings account to buy your house out from under the bank. The bitterness in my voice surprised even me. You just let me handle it and went back to treating me like the family afterthought. Madison was crying now too, tears streaming down her face. Rachel, we didn't know. We would never have wanted you to sacrifice so much for us. Wouldn't you? I challenged. Because when Dad called me that night, he specifically said he couldn't ask you for help because you'd just started your new job and needed to focus on your career. He said he couldn't tell Mom because the stress would make her sick. But me? I was expendable. I was the one who could be asked to fix the problem and then forgotten about. The truth of it hung heavy in the room. I watched my family grapple with the reality of their actions, with the pattern of behavior they'd never had to examine before. So, what happens now? Mom asked quietly. Are you really going to make us leave? I studied their faces, Mom's streaked with tears, Dad's gray with shock, Madison's young and frightened. Part of me, the part that had been hurt and ignored for so many years, wanted to say yes, wanted to watch them scramble to find somewhere else to live, wanted them to experience the kind of uncertainty and sacrifice I'd been living with. But looking at them now, seeing their genuine distress and confusion, I realized something unexpected. This wasn't really about revenge. This was about finally being seen. That depends, I said slowly, on whether anything changes. Changes how? Dad asked desperately. I want to know why, I said simply. I want to understand why you've spent my entire life treating Madison like she's made of spun gold, while treating me like I'm invisible. I want to know what I did wrong. What deficiency in me made you decide I wasn't worth the same love and attention you gave her? The silence that followed was different from before, heavier, more loaded with secrets and shame. Finally, Mom spoke, her voice barely audible. Rachel, there are things about your childhood, about our family, that you don't understand. Things we never told you, because we thought it would be easier, kinder. What things? Mom and Dad exchanged a look that spoke of long-held secrets and careful agreements. Things about how you came to be our daughter, Dad said quietly. Things about why we've always felt like we owed Madison something we could never give you. My heart started pounding. What do you mean how I came to be your daughter? Are you saying I'm adopted? No, Mom whispered. You're not adopted. But Madison is. Madison is adopted. The words hit me like a physical blow, reordering everything I thought I knew about our family dynamics. I stared at my sister, this woman I'd spent my entire life competing with for scraps of parental attention, and suddenly understood nothing at all. What do you mean Madison is adopted? I demanded, my voice rising higher than I'd intended. How is that possible? She looks just like Mom. Madison had gone completely white, her hand still touching the diamond necklace as if it were an anchor. I'm adopted? She whispered. Mom, Dad, what is she talking about? The moment stretched between us, loaded with 26 years of carefully constructed lies. Mom and Dad looked at each other with the expression of people who'd always known this conversation would come, but had hoped to avoid it forever. Sit down, both of you, Dad said finally, his voice heavy with defeat. This is going to take some explaining. I remained standing, too agitated to sit. Madison curled deeper into the armchair, looking suddenly very young and very lost. Madison, Mom began, her voice shaking, you came to us when you were 3 months old. Your birth mother was 16, from a wealthy family in Chicago. The adoption was private, arranged through lawyers, very discreet. But I have baby pictures, Madison protested weakly. Pictures of you in the hospital with me. Staged afterwards, Dad admitted. We had a photographer come to the house when you were about 4 months old. We thought it would be easier if you never had to know you were adopted. I was reeling, trying to process this information. So I'm your biological daughter, and Madison is adopted, but you've spent our entire lives treating her like the precious one, and me like the burden? It's not that simple, Rachel, Mom said, tears starting fresh. When we adopted Madison, we'd been trying to have children for 8 years. We'd gone through fertility treatments, miscarriages, disappointment after disappointment. Madison was our miracle baby, our answer to years of prayers. And then what happened? You had me by accident? The silence that followed was answer enough. Dad cleared his throat uncomfortably. You were born 2 years later. We hadn't been trying. We thought we couldn't have biological children. When your mom got pregnant with you, it was unexpected. The word hung in the air like an accusation. Unexpected. Unwanted. The child they'd never planned for. Born after they'd already gotten their perfect family. So, you had your miracle baby through adoption, I said slowly. And then I came along and ruined the perfect family dynamic. That's not how we saw it, Dad protested. But his words lacked conviction, isn't it? Because from where I'm standing, it explains everything. Why Madison got the bigger bedroom, the better clothes, the expensive activities. Why you paid for her college but told me I'd have to take out loans. Why she got the diamond necklace and I got socks. Madison was sobbing now, great heaving sobs that shook her entire body. I don't understand. If I'm adopted, why did you treat me better? Shouldn't it be the other way around? Mom reached for Madison's hand. Sweetheart, when you're adopted, sometimes the parents feel like they have to prove their love more, like they have to work harder to show that you're truly wanted and valued. While your biological child gets the message that she's taken for granted, I said bitterly. We never meant for you to feel that way, Dad said desperately. We love you both equally. No, you don't. The words came out flat and certain. You love Madison more because she was chosen. She was wanted. She was the answer to your prayers. I was just the surprise that came later, the child you had to fit into a family that was already complete without me. I started pacing the room, 28 years of confusion and hurt finally making sense. That's why you never pushed Madison to be independent, why you never expected her to pay for her own things. You felt guilty that she was adopted, So you overcompensated by making sure she never felt like anything less than a princess. And you, I turned to face them both. You expected me to be grateful for whatever scraps of attention I got because I was the real daughter. I was supposed to understand that Madison needed more care, more attention, more love because she'd already been rejected once. That's not, Mom started, but I cut her off. It is exactly that. And the worst part is that you've been so focused on making sure Madison never felt adopted that you forgot you had another daughter who needed love too. Madison looked up at me through her tears. Rachel, I never knew. I swear I never knew any of this. If I had known you were sacrificing so much for us, you didn't know, because you never had to know. You've lived your entire life being protected and sheltered and adored, while I've been the responsible one, the practical one, the one who could be counted on to handle problems without complaint. I thought about all the times I'd watched Madison get opportunities I'd been denied, all the times I'd been told to understand that Madison needed more support, more encouragement, more financial help. How many times had I heard Madison is still finding herself, or Madison needs time to figure out her path, while I was expected to have my life together from the age of 16. So when you were about to lose the house, I continued, of course you called me. Of course you expected me to fix it, because that's what I do. I solve problems while Madison gets to be the beloved daughter who needs protecting. We were wrong, Dad said quietly. We were wrong about so many things. But Rachel, you have to understand. When you love someone who's been abandoned once, you never want them to feel that pain again. And what about the pain of the daughter who was never abandoned but always felt like she should have been? The question came out rawer than I'd intended, revealing the heart of hurt I'd been carrying for so long. Mom was crying openly now. Rachel, we failed you. We see that now. We got so caught up in making sure Madison felt secure that we took your security for granted. You took me for granted, I corrected. You took my love, my loyalty, my financial support, my willingness to sacrifice for this family. You took all of it for granted because you assumed I would always be there, always be willing to fix whatever went wrong. Madison stood up suddenly, her face streaked with tears. I can't do this. I can't sit here and listen to how I've destroyed your life just by existing. You haven't destroyed my life by existing, I said, surprising myself with the gentleness in my voice. You've lived the life they created for you. But now we all have to figure out how to move forward with the truth. What truth? Madison asked. The truth that this family has been built on secrets and guilt and overcompensation. The truth that I've been keeping us all afloat financially while being treated like the family servant. The truth that you've been living a lie about your own identity for 26 years. I looked around the room at these three people who were my family. Broken and flawed and finally honest. And the truth that unless something fundamental changes, I'm done pretending any of this is okay. The weight of my words settled over the room like fallen snow, heavy and transformative. I walked to the window and looked out at the neighborhood I'd grown up in, the tree-lined street where I'd learned to ride a bike and walk to school and dreamed of a future where my parents might be proud of me. Now I owned a house on this street, and my family was just learning that fact. Rachel, Dad said quietly, I need to understand something. You said you've been paying our mortgage for 3 years. How much money are we talking about? I turned back to face them, noting how they were all sitting now. Deflated, uncertain, smaller somehow than they'd seemed a few hours ago when Madison was modeling her diamond necklace. The house cost me $340,000 when I bought it from the bank. I also paid off $47,000 in back payments and penalties. I pulled out my phone and scrolled to the spreadsheet I'd been keeping. Monthly mortgage payments of $1,147, property taxes of $4,200 annually, homeowner's insurance of $1,800 annually. I've also covered major repairs. The roof replacement last summer was $12,000. The new furnace 2 winters ago was $6,500. Madison's face grew more ashen with each number. Rachel, that's hundreds of thousands of dollars. $423,000 as of last month, I confirmed. Not including the smaller things. The times I've paid for groceries when you mentioned money was tight. The gas bills I've quietly handled when you were worried about heating costs. The medical copays I've covered for Mom's back problems. Medical copays? Mom whispered. But we have insurance through my work. Insurance that doesn't cover everything. Your physical therapy sessions last year, the MRI when your back got worse, the specialist consultations. I've been paying the portions your insurance didn't cover because Dad mentioned you were worried about the bills. I could see the horror dawning on their faces as they realized the scope of my financial support. It wasn't just the dramatic gesture of buying their house. It was 3 years of quiet, invisible sacrifices that had kept their lives comfortable, while mine grew increasingly austere. How? Dad asked. How did you manage all of this on a nonprofit salary? I didn't. I used my savings from my law practice, and I've been working consulting jobs on weekends and evenings, patent review work, legal research, document analysis for other firms. 60 to 80 hours a week between my day job and the consulting work. You've been working 80 hours a week to pay for our lives? Madison's voice was horrified. While living in a 400-square-foot studio apartment with no air conditioning, driving a car that breaks down monthly, and buying my clothes from thrift stores. I laughed, but there was no humor in it. Do you know what I had for dinner most nights this week? Ramen noodles and whatever vegetables were about to expire at the discount grocery store. Oh God, Mom breathed. Rachel, we had no idea. Because you never asked. When was the last time any of you visited my apartment? When was the last time you inquired about my finances, my health, my social life, my happiness? I was getting angry again, the hurt transforming into something sharper. You knew I left a high-paying job to work at a nonprofit, but none of you ever wondered how I was managing financially. We thought you were okay, Dad said weakly. You never complained, never asked for help, because I was helping you. I was the one providing help. I pulled out another folder from my purse. These are bank statements showing the transfers from my account to yours. 3 years of sacrificing my own financial security to keep you comfortable. And the only acknowledgement I got was being treated like an afterthought at family gatherings. Madison was staring at the diamond necklace in the mirror across the room, its sparkle seeming obscene now. How much did this cost? She asked quietly. Mom answered reluctantly. $3,000. $3,000, Madison repeated, while Rachel was eating ramen noodles and working herself into the ground to keep us in our house. We didn't know, Mom protested again, but the words sounded hollow even to her. That's the problem, I said. You didn't know because you didn't want to know. It was easier to accept the financial help without questioning it than to risk learning you might owe me something. I walked over to the mantelpiece where family photos were displayed. Graduation pictures, birthday parties, vacations, holidays. In almost every photo, Madison was centered, smiling, clearly the focus of attention. I appeared in the background or edges, often looking uncomfortable or left out. Look at these pictures, I said, gesturing to the display. Really look at them. Count how many show Madison front and center versus how many show me as the main subject. They looked, and I could see the realization dawning. Dozens of photos celebrating Madison's achievements, her milestones, her happiness, a handful showing me it all, and in those, I was clearly secondary. Your wedding photos, I said to Madison, pointing to her marriage to James 3 years ago. I was your maid of honor, but look at the family shots. Where am I standing? Madison examined the photos with growing shame. In every family grouping, she was in the center flanked by Mom and Dad, while I stood slightly apart, like an invited guest rather than a daughter. I planned that wedding, I continued quietly. I coordinated with vendors, managed the guest list, handled the flowers, dealt with the caterer when they tried to change the menu last minute. I spent 2 weeks of vacation time making sure your wedding was perfect. We know, Madison whispered. We appreciated it. Did you? Because you never thanked me. Not once. You thanked Mom for helping with the planning, even though her contribution was selecting the color scheme. You thanked Dad for supporting your vision, even though his contribution was writing a check. But the person who actually made it happen? The person who sacrificed her own time and energy to give you a fairy tale wedding? I got a generic thank you mention in your speech, lumped in with the caterer and the photographer. The silence stretched again. I could see them revisiting that day, understanding it differently now. Rachel, Dad said slowly, if we've been so terrible to you, if we've taken advantage of you for so long, why did you help us? Why did you save the house? It was the question I'd been asking myself for 3 years, the question that had driven me to this moment of confrontation. Because I kept hoping that if I was valuable enough, if I was helpful enough, if I sacrificed enough, you would finally see me the way you saw Madison. I kept thinking that eventually you'd realize what I was doing for you and be grateful, be proud, be loving toward me. I looked at each of their faces, seeing the shame and regret there, but you never did. You just accepted it all as your due and kept treating me like the lesser daughter. So I decided to stop hoping and start demanding the respect I'd been earning but never receiving. What do you want from us? Mom asked quietly. I want you to choose, I said simply. I want you to decide whether you want me in this family as an equal, valued member, or whether you want to keep treating me as the responsible caretaker, while Madison remains the beloved princess, because I won't continue the financial support if the emotional dynamics don't change. And if we choose wrong? Dad asked. Then you have 30 days to find somewhere else to live. The night stretched endlessly after my ultimatum. None of us seemed capable of leaving the living room, as if the weight of revealed secrets had created a gravitational pull that kept us tethered to this moment of reckoning. Madison had removed the diamond necklace and set it on the coffee table between us, where it lay like an accusation glittering in the lamplight. There's something else, Dad said finally, his voice rough with exhaustion and emotion. Something else we need to tell you about why we've treated you and Madison differently. I felt my stomach clench. What now? Mom reached for Dad's hand, and I saw them exchange another one of those loaded looks that spoke of long-held secrets. When we adopted Madison, Mom began hesitantly, we didn't just want a child. We needed one, specifically. What do you mean, needed one? Dad cleared his throat. Rachel, do you remember your Aunt Sarah, my sister? Of course. She died in that car accident when I was little. I had vague memories of a woman with Dad's eyes who used to bring me elaborate birthday presents. Sarah didn't die in a car accident, Dad said quietly. She died by suicide. The words hit me like a slap. What? But you always said. We lied. Sarah struggled with severe depression and bipolar disorder. She took her own life when she was 28 years old. Dad's voice broke slightly. She left behind a 3-month-old daughter. The pieces began clicking together with horrible clarity. Madison. Madison is your cousin, Mom confirmed. Sarah's daughter. We adopted her not just because we wanted a child, but because we felt responsible for Sarah's death. Responsible how? Because I knew Sarah was struggling, Dad said, his face twisting with old pain. I knew she was having a hard time adjusting to motherhood, that she wasn't sleeping, that she was saying things that worried me. But I was busy with my own life, my own problems. I told myself she just needed time to adjust. Madison had gone completely still, her face pale as moonlight. My birth mother was your sister? She killed herself? 3 days after you turned 3 months old, Mom said gently. She called me the night before and said she couldn't do it anymore, that she wasn't cut out to be a mother. I thought she meant she was tired, overwhelmed. I had no idea she was planning to. To what? Madison's voice was barely a whisper. She left you in your crib with a note asking us to take care of you, and then she drove her car into a tree. Dad's words came out in a rush, as if he couldn't bear to say them slowly. We found you 18 hours later when we went to check on her after she didn't answer her phone. I stared at my family, reeling from this revelation. So Madison isn't just adopted, she's our cousin, and her mother died by suicide. And we felt guilty, Mom said. So incredibly guilty. We should have seen the signs, should have intervened, should have helped Sarah before it was too late. Adopting Madison felt like the least we could do to make amends. That's why you overcompensated with her, I said, understanding flooding through me. You weren't just trying to make an adopted child feel loved. You were trying to make up for failing to save her mother. Every time we looked at Madison, we saw Sarah, Dad admitted. We saw the daughter of the sister I failed to help. We felt like we owed her everything we hadn't been able to give Sarah. Madison was crying again, but these tears were different, deeper, more primal. My mother didn't want me. She left me and killed herself because she couldn't stand being my mother. That's not true, Mom said firmly. Sarah was sick, sweetheart. She had an illness that made it impossible for her to think clearly. Her decision had nothing to do with you as a person. But it explains so much, Madison said through her tears. Why you've always been so protective of me, so worried about my mental health, so quick to help me when I struggled with anything. I thought about all the times Madison had been given extra support, extra understanding, extra patience when she faced challenges. Now I understood it wasn't just favoritism. It was fear. Fear that she might inherit Sarah's mental health struggles. Fear that she might follow her mother's path. And me? I asked. Where did I fit into this family therapy project? You were supposed to be the proof that we could do it right, Dad said quietly. You were our biological child, our chance to show that we could be good parents when we weren't carrying the weight of guilt and failure. Except that you carried that weight anyway, and it made you neglect me in favor of saving Madison. We thought you were stronger, Mom said desperately. You were always so independent, so capable. You seemed like you didn't need us the way Madison did. I was independent because I had to be. I was capable because no one else was going to handle things for me. I stood up, pacing again. You created a self-fulfilling prophecy where Madison got help and support so she never had to develop independence, while I got neglect, disguised as confidence in my abilities. We see that now, Dad said. We see how wrong we were. Do you? Because even tonight, when I delivered that eviction notice, your first concern was protecting Madison from the shock of learning she was adopted. Nobody asked how this situation affected me, how I felt about revealing these secrets, how I was coping with being the family scapegoat. Madison looked up at me with red-rimmed eyes. I'm sorry, Rachel. I'm so sorry. I never wanted to be the reason you were neglected. You weren't the reason, I said, my anger softening slightly. The reason was our parents' inability to deal with their guilt and trauma in a healthy way. They used you as their redemption project and me as their proof of parenting competence, and neither of us got to just be normal daughters. I looked at the three of them, broken, guilty, finally understanding the scope of damage their choices had caused. But here's what I need you to understand, I continued. Sarah's death was tragic, and Madison deserved love and support as an adopted child dealing with that legacy. But that didn't mean I deserved less love and support as your biological child. You could have helped her heal from her mother's suicide without treating me like I was disposable. You're right, Mom said simply. We're all right. We failed you both in different ways. So what happens now? Madison asked. How do we fix this? I looked at the eviction notice still sitting on the coffee table next to the diamond necklace. Now we figure out if this family can function with honesty instead of guilt and secrets. And we figure out if you can love me without me having to buy that love with financial sacrifice. What would that look like? Dad asked. It would look like equality. It would look like appreciation. It would look like acknowledging that I'm not just the family problem solver, but a person who deserves care and consideration and thoughtful Christmas gifts. I picked up the eviction notice and held it in my hands. You have 30 days to show me that things can be different. If they can't be, then maybe it's time for this family to finally break apart. 3 days passed in tense silence. I stayed away from the family house, working extra consulting hours and trying to process everything that had been revealed on Christmas Eve. My phone buzzed constantly with texts from Mom, Dad, and Madison, apologies, explanations, desperate attempts to bridge the chasm that had opened between us. On December 27th, Madison showed up at my studio apartment unannounced. We need to talk, she said when I opened the door, looking exhausted and haunted. I let her in, noting how she took in the cramped space, the Murphy bed that doubled as my couch, the tiny kitchenette, the single window that looked out onto an alley. This was where I'd been living while paying for their comfortable 4-bedroom house in the suburbs. It's smaller than I imagined, she said quietly. It's what I could afford after saving our family home. I gestured for her to sit in the only chair while I perched on the edge of my bed. What did you want to talk about? Madison pulled an envelope from her purse. I went to see a lawyer yesterday. About Sarah. About my adoption. About my legal rights to information about my birth mother. My heart sank. Madison, you don't need to... Yes, I do. I need to understand who she was, who I am, where I come from. Madison's voice was steady, but I could see the fear in her eyes, and I found out some things that change everything we thought we knew about our family. She handed me the envelope. Inside were legal documents, medical records, and what looked like a psychological evaluation. Sarah wasn't just struggling with postpartum depression, Madison said. She was struggling with the revelation that Dad wasn't my biological father. I stared at the documents, trying to make sense of what I was reading. What do you mean? Sarah had an affair. She got pregnant by someone else, someone she was afraid to name. When I was born and it became clear I wasn't Dad's biological child, she couldn't handle the guilt and shame. The papers confirmed it. Paternity test results showing that David Fletcher was not the biological father of the child born to Sarah Fletcher. So, you're not even Dad's niece, I said slowly. You're the daughter of his sister and some unknown man. And that's not the worst part. Madison pulled out another document. Look at the dates, Rachel. Look at when Sarah got pregnant with me. I studied the timeline, my blood growing cold as I realized what Madison was showing me. November 1996, I read aloud. But that's when Mom and Dad were having fertility problems, when they were going through their roughest patch as a couple. Madison's voice was flat, emotionless. Sarah got pregnant right around the time Mom and Dad were separated. The implication hit me like a freight train. You think Dad is your biological father after all? You think he had an affair with his own sister-in-law? I think that's exactly what happened. And I think that's the real reason our parents felt so guilty about Sarah's death, and why they've been overcompensating with me ever since. I stared at the documents, my mind racing. If Madison was right, then she wasn't just adopted. She was the product of Dad's affair with his brother's wife. She was simultaneously my half-sister and my adopted sister, the living reminder of Dad's betrayal of both Mom and Uncle James. Have you confronted them about this? I wanted to talk to you first. I wanted to know what you thought we should do. I looked at Madison, this woman I'd resented for so long, who was now discovering that her entire existence was even more complicated than either of us had imagined. Madison, if this is true, it explains everything. Why Dad felt so responsible for Sarah's death, why they adopted you, why they've treated you like you needed extra protection and care, and why they neglected you, Madison added quietly. Because every time they looked at you, you were a reminder of their legitimate family, while I was a reminder of Dad's infidelity and the tragedy it caused. But it also means that all these years, while they were making me feel like the unwanted biological child, you actually were Dad's biological child too. We sat in silence, processing the magnitude of this revelation. Everything we thought we knew about our family dynamics had been built on incomplete information. There's something else, Madison said, pulling out a final document. Sarah left a letter for me, to be given to me when I turned 25. My lawyer just got access to it from the sealed adoption files. She handed me a handwritten note, and I recognized Sarah's writing from old family letters I'd seen. My beautiful daughter, if you're reading this, it means I'm gone, and you're old enough to understand why I couldn't stay. I hope David and Linda have given you a good life, a better life than I could have provided. I need you to know that I loved you, but I couldn't live with the shame of what I'd done. Your father is a good man who made a terrible mistake with me during a dark time in his marriage. I seduced him when he was vulnerable, and I got pregnant, hoping it would make him leave Linda for me. When you were born and it became clear you were his child, I thought maybe we could be a family. But David chose Linda and their marriage over us, and I couldn't bear raising you, knowing that your father was in love with someone else. I don't blame David for choosing his wife. I blame myself for putting him in an impossible position. But I can't live watching you grow up knowing that your very existence destroyed your father's marriage and my relationship with my sister-in-law. I'm leaving you with David and Linda because they're the only parents you should have. They can give you stability and love without the complications of truth. Please don't hate them for the lies they've told you. They're protecting you from a very painful reality. I hope you have a beautiful life, my sweet girl. I'm sorry I wasn't strong enough to be the mother you deserved. All my love, Sarah. I finished reading the letter with tears in my eyes. Madison was crying too, finally understanding the full scope of the tragedy that had shaped our family. She killed herself because she couldn't bear being the other woman, Madison whispered, because she couldn't stand that Dad chose Mom over her. And our parents have been living with the guilt ever since, knowing that Dad's affair caused Sarah's death and left you motherless. That's why they could never treat me normally. Every time they looked at me, they saw their guilt, their failure, their responsibility for a tragedy that could have been prevented. I reached over and took Madison's hand. And every time they looked at me, they saw the legitimate daughter of the marriage that Dad had chosen over Sarah. I was the proof that their reconciliation worked, while you were the proof that it had nearly been destroyed. No wonder they treated us so differently, Madison said. We weren't just two daughters. We were symbols of Dad's choice and its consequences. I thought about Dad's behavior over the years, his obvious guilt and overcompensation, his desperate need to make Madison feel secure and loved. I thought about Mom's complicated relationship with Madison, loving her as a daughter, while knowing she was also the product of her husband's betrayal. Madison, I said slowly, I think we need to confront them together. I think it's time for this family to finally face the complete truth about everything. Are you ready for that? Ready to learn that everything we thought we knew was wrong? I looked around my tiny apartment, thought about the eviction notice I'd served, considered the 3 years of financial sacrifice I'd made for a family that had been lying to themselves and each other for decades. I'm ready to stop living in a house built on secrets and guilt. Whatever the truth is, it has to be better than the lies we've been accepting. Madison nodded. Then let's go home and finish this conversation once and for all. We arrived at the house to find Mom and Dad sitting at the kitchen table, surrounded by photo albums, adoption papers, and what looked like decades worth of documents they'd apparently been sorting through since Christmas Eve. They looked up when we entered, their faces showing a mixture of relief and terror at seeing us together. We've been waiting for you, Dad said quietly. Both of you. Madison and I sat across from them, the kitchen table now serving as a sort of courtroom where 28 years of family secrets would finally be judged. We know about Sarah's letter, Madison said without preamble, placing the document on the table between us. We know Dad is my biological father. The silence that followed was different from all the others we'd endured over the past few days. This wasn't the silence of shock or discovery. This was the silence of people finally facing truths they'd been running from for decades. How long have you known? I asked. Since before we adopted you, Mom said to Madison, her voice barely audible. We knew from the moment you were born that David was your biological father. Dad looked like he'd aged years in the past few days. Sarah told us the truth right after you were born. She said she couldn't handle being a single mother to my child, couldn't bear watching Linda raise the baby of my affair while she struggled alone. So you adopted me to assuage your guilt, Madison said, but there was no accusation in her voice now, just exhaustion. We adopted you because we loved you, Mom corrected. But yes, we also felt responsible for the circumstances that created you. I leaned forward. Tell us about the affair. Tell us the whole truth. Dad closed his eyes, looking like a man about to confess his worst sins. Linda and I had been trying to have children for 8 years. The fertility treatments, the miscarriages, the disappointment. It nearly destroyed our marriage. We separated for 6 months in 1996, and during that separation, you slept with Sarah, Madison said. Sarah was going through her own difficult time. Her husband James was traveling constantly for work, and she felt neglected and lonely. We found comfort in each other's pain. Dad's voice was heavy with old shame. It started as friendship and support, and it became more. How long did the affair last? I asked. 3 months, from November 1996 to February 1997, when Linda and I decided to try reconciling. Dad looked at Mom with something that might have been gratitude. I ended things with Sarah when Linda and I got back together. But Sarah was already pregnant, Madison said. Yes, she told me about the pregnancy in March, after Linda and I had been working on our marriage for a month. Sarah wanted me to leave Linda and be with her, to raise you together, but you chose Mom. I chose the marriage I'd committed to, the woman I'd loved for 10 years before our problems started. Dad reached for Mom's hand. I told Sarah I would support her financially and emotionally as your father, but I couldn't leave Linda. And that's when Sarah's mental health started deteriorating, Mom added. She became obsessed with the idea that David would eventually come to his senses and choose her. When you were born, and it became clear that wasn't going to happen, she couldn't accept it. She killed herself because Dad wouldn't leave you for her, Madison said flatly. She killed herself because she was mentally ill and couldn't cope with the complexity of the situation, Dad corrected gently. The affair was my fault. The pregnancy was my responsibility, but Sarah's suicide was the result of her illness, not just my choices. I thought about this revelation, trying to understand how it had shaped our family dynamics. So when you adopted Madison, you weren't just taking in your sister's orphaned child. You were taking in your own biological daughter, the product of an affair that had nearly destroyed your marriage. And we were trying to make amends for a tragedy we felt responsible for, Mom said. Every day for the past 26 years, we've looked at Madison and seen the consequences of David's affair and my inability to save my marriage without outside damage. That's why you overcompensated with her, I said. You weren't just trying to make an adopted child feel loved. You were trying to prove that Dad's choice to stay with you hadn't doomed Madison to a life of feeling unwanted. We wanted Madison to know she was valued and cherished, despite the circumstances of her conception, Dad said. We wanted her to never feel like she was the product of something shameful or wrong. But in doing that, you made me feel like I was less important than the daughter who represented your guilt and redemption. We thought you were secure in our love, Mom said desperately. You were our planned child, our intended family. We thought you understood that you were valued without us having to prove it constantly. No, you thought I was low maintenance compared to the daughter whose very existence reminded you of your family's biggest trauma. I could feel the anger building again, but it was different now, cleaner, more focused. You treated Madison like she needed extra love because of her tragic origins, and you treated me like I should be grateful for whatever attention I got because I hadn't been traumatized by adoption and suicide. Madison spoke up quietly, but I wasn't actually adopted by strangers, was I? I was raised by my biological father and his wife. The tragedy wasn't that I was separated from my family. The tragedy was that the family I was born into was already broken. We tried to fix what was broken, Dad said. We tried to create a stable, loving home for both of you. By lying to us about our fundamental identities for decades, I said. By building our entire family structure on secrets and guilt instead of honesty and genuine affection. We were protecting you both. You were protecting yourselves, I interrupted. You were protecting yourselves from having to face the real consequences of Dad's affair and Sarah's death. It was easier to pretend Madison was an adopted child you'd rescued than to admit she was Dad's biological daughter from an affair. It was easier to treat me as the low-maintenance biological child than to acknowledge that your guilt over Madison was making you neglect me. The room fell silent again. I could see my parents grappling with this assessment, recognizing the truth in it even as it clearly pained them. What do you want from us now? Mom asked finally. How do we move forward from here? I looked at Madison, this woman who was both my adopted sister and my half-sister, whose mother had died because she couldn't compete with my mother for our father's love. I want honesty, I said. Complete honesty, no matter how painful. I want acknowledgement of the ways we've all been damaged by these secrets, and I want proof that this family can function based on genuine love instead of guilt and overcompensation. And the house? Dad asked quietly. The eviction notice? I thought about the past few days, about everything I'd learned about my family's complicated history. The house had become a symbol of so many things, their financial irresponsibility, my invisible sacrifices, the way they'd taken my support for granted. But it had also been Sarah's house first, the place where she'd lived with her husband before the affair that changed everything. It was where Madison had been conceived in secret and shame, where Sarah had returned to care for her baby before her final, desperate act. The house stays in my name, I said finally, but you can keep living there if you can live with the truth about who owns it and why. What does that mean? It means acknowledging that I saved your family home through my own sacrifice. It means appreciating that support instead of taking it for granted. It means treating me like a valued family member instead of the family servant. I stood up, feeling lighter than I had in years. And it means figuring out how to be a family built on choice and love, instead of a family built on guilt and secrets. 2 weeks passed before Madison came to see me again. She'd been unusually quiet during our family meetings, processing her own revelations while watching our parents struggle with the aftermath of their exposed secrets. When she knocked on my apartment door on a rainy Thursday evening, I could tell something had shifted in her. I need to tell you something, she said, settling into the familiar chair across from my bed. Something I've never told anyone, not even James. I set down the legal briefs I'd been reviewing for a consulting project and gave her my full attention. Madison looked nervous in a way I'd rarely seen. She'd always been the confident one, the golden child who navigated life with an ease I'd envied. "I've known," she said quietly. "For 3 years, I've known about the financial help you've been giving our parents." The words hit me like a physical blow. "What do you mean you've known?" "I saw one of your bank transfers by accident when I was helping Dad with his computer. A transfer for $1,147 with mortgage payment in the memo line." Madison's voice was steady, but I could see the shame in her eyes. "I asked Dad about it, and he broke down and told me everything. About the near foreclosure, about you buying the house, about the monthly payments you'd been making." I stared at her, feeling a new kind of betrayal wash over me. "You've known for 3 years that I was sacrificing everything to keep you all comfortable, and you never said anything?" "I wanted to. God, Rachel, I wanted to thank you, to acknowledge what you were doing, to find some way to help." Madison's composure finally cracked, and tears started flowing. "But Dad made me promise not to tell you I knew. He said it would ruin everything, that you were helping because you wanted to help, and if you knew we were aware of the sacrifice, you might stop. So instead, you all just let me continue thinking you were oblivious and ungrateful." "We weren't ungrateful. I was never ungrateful." Madison pulled a folder from her purse, similar to the ones I'd been carrying around full of family secrets. "I've been keeping track of everything, Rachel. Every dollar you've spent on us, every sacrifice you've made. I've been documenting it all because I knew someday we'd have to face it." She handed me the folder, and I opened it to find meticulous records, spreadsheets tracking my financial contributions, photocopies of bank statements, even printed emails from Dad discussing my help. Madison had been maintaining her own accounting of my sacrifices. "Why didn't you try to help?" I asked. "If you knew what I was doing, why didn't you contribute to the family finances yourself?" Madison's face flushed with shame. "Because I was selfish. Because I liked having my entire salary to myself, liked being able to travel and shop and go out to dinner without worrying about money. I told myself that you were choosing to help them, that it wasn't my responsibility, while knowing that I was eating ramen noodles and working 80-hour weeks to afford it." Yes, the admission came out as barely a whisper, and I hated myself for it, but not enough to change my behavior. I flipped through Madison's documentation, seeing my own financial records reflected back at me through her meticulous tracking. "What about the Christmas gifts? Did you know they were spending money on expensive presents for you while giving me socks?" "I chose the necklace," Madison said, her voice breaking completely. "Mom and Dad asked what I wanted for Christmas, and I sent them a link to a $3,000 necklace, knowing they were struggling financially, knowing you were the one actually paying their bills." The confession was devastating in its honesty. Madison hadn't just been an unknowing beneficiary of our parents' favoritism, she'd been an active participant in it, even while being aware of my sacrifices. "Madison, how could you do that? How could you ask for something so expensive knowing what it would cost the family?" "Because I was angry." The words exploded out of her. "I was angry about learning I was adopted, angry about discovering my mother's suicide, angry about finding out Dad was actually my biological father through an affair. I felt like my entire identity was a lie, and I wanted something beautiful and expensive to make me feel better, at my expense. At your expense, yes, and I justified it by telling myself that you were successful, that you could afford it, that you were choosing to help the family." Madison wiped her eyes with shaking hands. "I told myself that you were the responsible one who had everything figured out, so it was okay for me to be the irresponsible one who got to be taken care of." I thought about the dynamic she was describing, how my role as the stable, capable daughter had given everyone else permission to be financially reckless, knowing I would bail them out. "What about James? Does your husband know about any of this?" Madison's face went white. "James thinks my parents paid for our wedding. He thinks they've been helping us with our down payment for the house we're trying to buy. He has no idea that you've been supporting them, or that I've been taking money from people who were struggling. So you've been lying to your husband too." "Yes, and Rachel, there's something else. Something worse." Madison's voice dropped to almost a whisper. "James got a promotion 6 months ago. A big promotion with a substantial raise. We could afford to help Mom and Dad now, could afford to take over some of the financial burden from you. But you haven't. Because I'm terrified that if I tell James the truth about our family's finances, he'll realize what kind of person I am. He'll see that I've been selfish and dishonest, that I've been letting my sister sacrifice her own financial security while I lived comfortably off the benefits." I stared at Madison, seeing her clearly for the first time in our lives. She wasn't just the favored daughter who'd been sheltered from responsibility. She was someone who'd actively chosen comfort over integrity, who'd prioritized her own wants over her family's needs, even while knowing the cost. "Madison, you have to tell James. You have to come clean about all of this. What if he leaves me? What if he can't forgive me for being so selfish and dishonest? Then you'll face the consequences of your choices. the same way I've been facing the consequences of mine. I closed her folder and handed it back to her. But you can't build a marriage on lies about who you are and what your family dynamics actually involve. Madison nodded slowly, accepting the hard truth. What about us? Can you forgive me for knowing about your sacrifices and not stopping them? I considered the question, thinking about the 3 years Madison had spent watching me struggle while enjoying the benefits of my financial support. I don't know yet, I said honestly. I need time to process the fact that my sister, the person I thought was just an innocent victim of our parents' favoritism, was actually complicit in taking advantage of me. I understand. But Madison, here's what I need you to understand. This family can't heal until everyone stops lying. Not just mom and dad about the affair and adoption, you about your knowledge of my financial support, me about the extent of my resentment and anger. All of it has to come out, even if it destroys everything, especially if it destroys everything. Because what we had before wasn't worth preserving. It was built on exploitation and lies and guilt. I looked at this woman who was my sister in so many complicated ways. Maybe we can build something better from the wreckage. Madison stood to leave, then turned back at the door. Rachel, for what it's worth, I'm proud of you. For standing up to us. For demanding better. For refusing to accept being treated badly anymore. It's worth something, I said. But it's not worth enough to make up for 3 years of conscious exploitation. After she left, I sat in my tiny apartment, thinking about the complexity of family love, how it could coexist with selfishness, how it could be real and destructive at the same time, how it could motivate both sacrifice and cruelty. Tomorrow I would decide whether the eviction notice would stand, or whether this family had proven it was worth saving. The emergency family meeting was called for Sunday afternoon, 2 days before the eviction notice would become legally enforceable. I arrived at the house, my house, to find everyone already gathered in the living room, the same space where this entire confrontation had begun 2 weeks earlier. But the atmosphere was different now, charged with the electricity of people who had finally run out of secrets to hide. James was there too, Madison's husband of 3 years, looking shell-shocked and confused. Madison had clearly followed through on her promise to tell him the truth about our family's financial situation and her knowledge of my sacrifices. Rachel, Dad said as I entered, before we start, I want you to know that we've prepared something for you. A formal acknowledgement of what you've done for this family. He handed me a typed document, and I could see Mom's careful formatting and legal language. It was essentially a contract, outlining every financial contribution I'd made over the past 3 years, and establishing terms for future family financial arrangements. We want to make it official, Mom said. We want to acknowledge in writing that you own this house, that you've been supporting us, and that we've been taking advantage of your generosity. I scanned the document, noting the meticulous detail and the legal weight of their admission. This is a start, I said. But documents don't change behavior. I need to see evidence that the emotional dynamics of this family are changing too. Actually, James spoke up, his voice strained. I think I can help with that. Everyone turned to look at him. James was a quiet man, a software engineer who'd always seemed content to let Madison be the center of attention in social situations. But now he looked angry in a way I'd never seen before. Madison told me everything, he said, looking directly at me. About your financial support, about her knowledge of your sacrifices, about the favoritism and lies that have defined this family for decades, and I have something to say about it. He stood up, his hands clenched into fists. Rachel, what you've done for this family is extraordinary and generous beyond anything I could have imagined, but what's been done to you is unconscionable. James, Madison started, but he held up a hand to stop her. No, Madison, I need to say this. He turned back to me. I've been married to your sister for 3 years, and I thought I knew her. I thought she was kind and generous and caring. But learning that she's been living comfortably off your sacrifices while knowing the cost to you, that's not the woman I thought I married. Madison's face crumpled. James, please. And finding out that she chose a $3,000 necklace for Christmas, while knowing you were eating ramen noodles to afford her parents' mortgage, that level of selfishness is staggering. The room went silent. James had articulated what everyone was thinking, but hadn't been willing to say directly. So here's what's going to happen, James continued, his voice gaining strength. Madison and I are going to take over the mortgage payments on this house immediately. We're going to reimburse you for every dollar you've spent on this family over the past 3 years. And we're going to do it whether Madison likes it or not. James, we can't afford, Madison protested. We can absolutely afford it. We've been saving for a house down payment, but this is more important. James looked at his wife with disappointment that was painful to witness. And if you can't see that, then we have bigger problems in our marriage than I realized. Dad cleared his throat. James, that's very generous. But it's not generous. It's what should have been happening all along. James sat back down, his anger giving way to exhaustion. Rachel shouldn't have had to buy your house to save it from foreclosure. She shouldn't have been working 80-hour weeks to keep your family comfortable while living in poverty herself, and she definitely shouldn't have been getting socks for Christmas while Madison got diamonds. We understand that now, Mom said quietly. We're trying to figure out how to make amends. Here's how you make amends, I said, surprised by the steadiness of my own voice. You stop treating me like the family servant who's supposed to solve problems without recognition. You stop treating Madison like a delicate flower who needs protection from reality. You start functioning like adults who take responsibility for their own financial decisions. I looked around the room at these people who were my family, in all their complicated, damaged glory. And you start telling the truth about why this family has been so dysfunctional for so long. What do you mean? Dad asked. I mean, you tell the complete truth about Sarah's affair and suicide. You tell the truth about the guilt and overcompensation that's defined your parenting choices. You tell the truth about the financial irresponsibility that led to near foreclosure. You tell the truth about all of it, so we can finally deal with reality instead of managing secrets. Mom and Dad exchanged one of their loaded looks, but this time it was different, resigned instead of conspiratorial. You're right, Dad said finally. We've been managing this family based on guilt and fear instead of love and honesty. We've been so afraid of facing the consequences of my affair and Sarah's death that we've created new damage trying to avoid old pain. And we've taught you and Madison terrible lessons about relationships and responsibility in the process, Mom added. We taught Madison that she deserved special treatment without reciprocal obligations, and we taught you that love had to be earned through sacrifice and service, both of which are toxic ways to approach family relationships, I said. Yes, they are, James spoke up again. So what happens now? How do we move forward from here? I looked at the eviction notice still sitting on the coffee table, then at the legal document acknowledging my financial contributions, then at the faces of my family members, all of them finally seeing each other clearly for the first time in decades. Now we figure out if we can build something healthy from all this dysfunction, I said. We figure out if this family can function based on mutual respect instead of guilt and exploitation. What would that look like? Madison asked quietly. It would look like everyone taking responsibility for their own choices and consequences. It would look like appreciation instead of entitlement. It would look like honesty about both the good and bad aspects of our relationships. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the neighborhood I'd grown up in, but never felt like I truly belonged to. And it would look like me being valued as a daughter and sister, not just as the family problem solver. We want that, Dad said desperately. We want to learn how to be a real family instead of this broken system we've created. Then you'll have to prove it. And the first step is ripping up this eviction notice and starting over as equals. I turned back to face them. These people who had hurt me and disappointed me, but who were also the only family I had. Because despite everything, I still love you. But I won't continue to sacrifice my own life for people who don't value the sacrifice. 6 months later, I was sitting in the backyard of the house I owned, but no longer felt burdened by, watching my family attempt something we'd never managed before. A normal Sunday dinner without undercurrents of resentment, guilt, or hidden agendas. Madison and James had indeed taken over the mortgage payments, and they'd insisted on reimbursing me for the full amount I'd spent supporting the family over 3 years. The check had been substantial enough to allow me to move out of my studio apartment and into a beautiful one-bedroom place with actual sunlight and a kitchen large enough for a table. More importantly, they'd insisted on transparency about their finances and decision-making processes. No more $3,000 impulse purchases without family discussion. No more assumptions that someone else would handle problems. No more taking my sacrifices for granted. How's the new case going? Dad asked me, passing a bowl of salad that Mom had actually asked me to help prepare. A small gesture that meant more than he probably realized. Good. We're representing a pharmaceutical company that's being sued for patent infringement, and I think we have a strong defense. I accepted the salad, noting how Dad's question showed genuine interest in my work, instead of polite dismissal. The patent law is complex, but that's what makes it interesting. Are you thinking about going back to corporate law full-time? Madison asked. She'd been making an effort to show interest in my life, asking follow-up questions and remembering details from previous conversations. Maybe. The consulting work has been lucrative enough that I'm not desperate for the nonprofit salary anymore. I can afford to be more selective about the social justice work I take on. It was a luxury I'd never had before, being able to choose work based on passion instead of financial necessity. The reimbursement money had given me options I'd forgotten existed. Speaking of which, Mom said, I have something for you. She handed me a wrapped package that was clearly not socks. Inside was a beautiful leather portfolio with my initials embossed in gold, the kind of professional accessory I'd never been able to justify buying for myself. I know it's not Christmas or your birthday, Mom said, but I wanted to give you something that acknowledged your professional accomplishments, something that reflected how proud we are of your career success. The gift was thoughtful and expensive, and clearly chosen with care. Everything my Christmas socks hadn't been. But more than that, it represented recognition of who I was as a person, not just what I could do for the family. "Thank you," I said, and meant it. James had been quiet during most of the meal, but now he looked up from his plate. "Rachel, I need to apologize to you again for how long it took me to understand what was happening in this family." "James, you apologized months ago." "I know, but I keep thinking about it. Madison and I had been together for 3 years before I learned the truth about the family dynamics. I should have noticed that something was wrong, should have questioned why your parents seemed so focused on Madison while taking you for granted. You weren't responsible for noticing our family's dysfunction," I said gently. "You married Madison, not all of us. But I benefited from your sacrifices without knowing it. Our wedding, the gifts Madison's parents gave us, the financial stability they seemed to have, all of it was possible because you were supporting them behind the scenes." Madison reached for her husband's hand. "We both benefited, and we both should have been more aware of the costs." The conversation was one we'd had variations of multiple times over the past 6 months, but I didn't mind the repetition. It felt like a form of healing, this ability to acknowledge difficult truths without the conversations exploding into accusations and defensiveness. "The important thing is that we're all aware now," I said, "and we're all making different choices because of that awareness." Dad raised his glass of wine. "I want to propose a toast to Rachel for having the courage to demand better from us, for refusing to accept being treated badly just because it was easier for the rest of us." "To Rachel," the others echoed, raising their glasses. As we drank, I thought about the journey that had brought us to this point. The eviction notice had never been enforced. I'd torn it up the night after our final family confrontation, once I'd seen evidence that real change was possible. But the threat of it had accomplished what I'd needed it to accomplish. It had forced everyone to confront the reality of our family dynamics and the cost of maintaining them. "I have some news," Madison said, as we were clearing the dinner dishes. "James and I have decided to start trying for a baby." The announcement was met with excitement from Mom and Dad, but I found myself studying Madison's face carefully. "How are you feeling about becoming a mother?" I asked. Given everything we've learned about Sarah's struggles, it was a question that might have seemed cruel 6 months ago. But our family had learned to address difficult topics directly, instead of dancing around them. "Scared," Madison admitted, "but also determined to do better than previous generations. I want to raise children who understand that love isn't conditional on being perfect or convenient, and that family members should support each other without exploitation. We all want that," Mom said softly. "We want to break the cycle of dysfunction that's defined this family for too long." As I drove home to my bright, comfortable apartment that evening, I reflected on how much had changed since Christmas Eve. I was no longer working 80-hour weeks or eating ramen noodles. I was no longer the family's invisible supporter, or the daughter whose sacrifices went unacknowledged. More importantly, I was no longer part of a family system built on secrets, guilt, and unequal dynamics. We were still working on building something healthier, but at least we were doing it with honesty about where we'd been and where we wanted to go. My phone buzzed with a text from Madison. "Thank you for not giving up on us. I know it would have been easier to walk away." I typed back, "Thank you for proving that change was possible. I know it would have been easier to keep things the way they were. It wasn't a perfect family. We probably never would be perfect. But we were finally a real family, built on truth instead of lies, on mutual respect instead of guilt and exploitation. And for the first time in my life, that felt like enough."